At the twilight of the 17th century, the Alcazar of Madrid was a stage of shadows and whispers, a place where the grandeur of an empire faded like the smoke of an extinguished candle. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, lay on his deathbed, consumed by a life of illness and a reign that seemed a race against time. His death in November 1700 was not just the end of a man but the collapse of a dynasty that had dominated Europe for 2 centuries. The tragic end of Charles II, nicknamed the Bewitched, is a story of human frailty, court intrigues, and an empire on the brink of the abyss. With one foot in the solemnity of historical facts and the other in the acknowledgement of the tragic absurdity that marked his life, this account explores how a sickly king became the epicenter of a crisis that changed the world. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, at a time when Spain desperately needed a strong heir. His arrival was met with relief, a male heir, but also with concern. From his earliest days, the young prince showed signs of weakness. He did not walk until he was 10. His speech was labored, and his body seemed unable to bear the weight of the crown awaiting him. The inbreeding of the Habsburgs, a practice that had turned the family tree into a tangle of consanguinity, was to blame. Philip IV and Mariana, uncle and niece, were just one link in a chain of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces dating back to Charles V. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient exceeded 25%, higher than that of a child of siblings, which explained his prominent jaw, the infamous Habsburg prognathism, that made eating and speaking difficult, as well as a litany of ailments including epilepsy, digestive problems, recurrent infections, and infertility that would be the death sentence of the dynasty. Charles's childhood was a parade of doctors, wet nurses, and courtiers who observed him with a mix of pity and anxiety. The portraits of the time, painted by artists like Juan Carreño de Miranda, attempted to mask his frailty with majestic robes, velvet cloaks, and gleaming crowns, but his sunken eyes and pallor told the truth. The Spanish court, with its rigid etiquette, was a world of endless ceremonies where every gesture was calculated, from how wine was served to the order in which nobles entered audiences. For a sickly child, this environment must have been suffocating, like living inside a Baroque painting where everything is grandiose but no one dares to move. Courtiers, dressed in dark suits and ruffled collars, treated him like a fragile relic, someone to be protected from the world and, at times, from himself. At the age of 4, after the death of Philip IV in 1665, Charles was proclaimed king, but the throne was more a burden than an honor. His mother, Mariana of Austria, served as regent during the early years of a reign steeped in instability. Mariana, a devout but politically inexperienced woman, relied on validos, those advisors who often governed in the shadows. The first was Juan Everardo Nithard, an Austrian Jesuit whose closeness to the Queen Mother sparked resentment among Spanish nobles. Nithard, with his air of a confessor and boundless ambition, attempted to reform the administration and cut expenses, but his foreign origin made him an easy target. Nobles, jealous of his influence, accused him of everything from incompetence to treason. In 1669, he was ousted, leaving Mariana even more vulnerable to court intrigues. Charles's court was a microcosm of rivalries where every decision was a minefield. One of the most prominent figures was Juan José of Austria, the illegitimate son of Philip IV and Charles's half-brother. Charismatic, ambitious, and enviably healthy, Juan José was everything Charles could not be. His presence was a constant threat to Mariana's supporters, and his aspirations to power made him a magnet for the discontented. In 1677, he led a coup that ousted the Queen Mother's validos and placed him at the head of the government. Juan José had vision. He wanted to modernize the army and stabilize the economy. But his premature death in 1679 left Charles once again at the mercy of rival factions. The court returned to its usual cycle of intrigues, with nobles and clerics vying like cats in an alley for control of the kingdom. Spain, at the time, was an empire spanning from the Netherlands to the Americas, from the Philippines to Naples, but it was in free fall. The economy was a disaster, drained by wars and the mismanagement of American silver. Inflation, fueled by the influx of precious metals that no one knew how to manage, had skyrocketed prices, making life impossible for peasants. Taxes, which fell mainly on the lower classes, were suffocating, while the nobility and clergy, exempt from many levies, lived in a bubble of privilege. Cities like Madrid or Seville were filled with beggars, and rural areas suffered periodic famines. The plague, though less devastating than in previous centuries, still claimed lives, and wars like the War of Devolution, 1667 to 1668, or the 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, against France drained the treasury and exposed Spain's military weakness. The Armada, once the terror of the seas, was now a shadow of itself, unable to compete with the fleets of England or the Netherlands. Despite his frailty, Charles was not the incompetent figure history sometimes portrays. He had moments of lucidity and a genuine desire to be a good king. He read the reports sent by his advisors, attended Council of State meetings when his health allowed, and showed almost supernatural patience in enduring his nobles' disputes. In 1675, at the age of 14, he reached the age of majority and formally assumed the government, but his physical weakness made him dependent on his validos. One of the most influential was the Duke of Medinaceli, who in the 1680s attempted to stabilize the economy by reducing taxes and reorganizing colonial administration. His efforts, however, clashed with the resistance of a nobility clinging to its privileges and a slow, corrupt bureaucracy. Later, the Count of Oropesa took the reins, attempting to cut court expenses and improve revenue collection, but he fell from grace, accused of corruption. The story of these validos is a reminder that in Charles II Spain, power was a game of musical chairs where no one sat for long. Charles's health was the elephant in the room, a topic everyone knew about but few dared to mention aloud. The doctors of the time, with their limited knowledge, treated him with methods that today seem closer to alchemy than medicine. Bloodletting, meant to balance the humors, only weakened him further. They prescribed potions with exotic ingredients like powdered rhinoceros horn, believed to strengthen the body, or poultices of pigeon dung, supposedly to relieve his respiratory issues. These treatments, far from helping, likely worsened his condition. Epilepsy tormented him with frequent seizures, sometimes in public, fueling rumors of his supposed curse. His digestive system was so fragile he could barely keep food down, and recurrent infections left him bedridden for days. Yet, against all odds, Charles survived childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, a testament to his stubbornness or, perhaps, a miracle. The nickname, the Bewitched, was not just a cruel moniker. It reflected the mindset of an era where science and superstition coexisted in an uneasy dance. The belief that Charles was under a spell was taken seriously by many, including some in the court. In 1698, as his health worsened, a formal exorcism was organized in the Alcazar. A Dominican friar, armed with crucifixes, holy water, and litanies, attempted to expel the demons supposedly inhabiting the king's body. The scene must have been worthy of a Goya painting, a gaunt monarch, seated on a throne too large for him, surrounded by clerics chanting prayers while courtiers watched with a mix of fear and fascination. The exorcism had no effect, of course, but it illustrates how Baroque Spain sought answers in the supernatural when reality was too harsh. Doctors, unable to explain Charles's ailments, did little to dispel these rumors, and the idea of a spell became a convenient explanation for a problem no one understood. The inbreeding of the Habsburgs is the core of Charles's tragedy and deserves detailed exploration. Marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces were common to maintain power and the dynasty's purity but had devastating consequences. Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, Charles's parents, shared a great-grandfather, Charles V, making them close relatives. Their grandparents were also cousins, and further back, a web of consanguineous unions made the Habsburg DNA a repetitive puzzle. The result was an inbreeding coefficient in Charles that exceeded that of a child of siblings, a level that modern science knows causes severe genetic issues. His prominent jaw, known as the Habsburg prognathism, was so severe that he could barely chew or speak clearly. His neurological problems, like epilepsy, and his infertility were symptoms of a genetic collapse that 17th-century doctors could not comprehend. Modern studies suggest Charles may have suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, a genetic condition affecting sexual development and causing infertility. But in 1700, without DNA testing, the easiest explanation was to blame witchcraft or fate. Charles's infertility was the issue that turned his reign into an international crisis. He married twice in a desperate attempt to secure the dynasty's continuity. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived in Spain in 1679 at the age of 17 as part of an alliance with France. Marie-Louise was a vivacious young woman whose charm brightened the somber Spanish court. Her energy contrasted with Charles's frailty, and according to chroniclers, he adored her. However, their marriage was complicated. Charles, shy and aware of his physical limitations, seemed unable to meet the expectations of a royal union. Marie-Louise, meanwhile, felt trapped in a marriage with no future, in a rigid and intrigue-filled court. Despite their efforts, there were no children, and when she died in 1689 at the age of 26, the court was rife with rumors. The autopsy pointed to appendicitis, but in a place where paranoia was common currency, many suspected poisoning. Marie-Louise's death was a harsh blow to Charles, plunging him into a depression that further weakened his already fragile health. The second marriage, to Mariana of Neuburg in 1690, was another attempt to produce an heir. Mariana, a strong-willed and ambitious German, was the opposite of Marie-Louise. Her arrival brought tensions, especially with the Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, with whom she constantly clashed. Mariana of Neuburg was not popular among Spanish nobles, who saw her as a manipulative foreigner. Her favoritism toward Austrian and German interests fueled rumors, and her inability to conceive a child put her in a difficult position. Yet, credit must be given. Dealing with a sickly husband, a hostile court, and the pressure of all of Europe was no easy task. Her influence over Charles grew over the years, but so did her unpopularity, and rumors that she was trying to manipulate the king to favor Austria did not help. The lack of an heir turned the succession into a ticking time bomb that all European powers watched greedily. The Spanish throne was not just a seat in Madrid, it was the key to an empire spanning half the world. Whoever inherited it would control territories in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Europe, as well as a fleet that, though weakened, was still coveted. France, under Louis XIV, wanted the throne for Philip of Anjou, his grandson and great-grandson of Philip IV. Austria supported Archduke Charles, son of Emperor Leopold I and also a Habsburg descendant. England and the Netherlands, concerned about the balance of power, preferred a compromise, like dividing the empire. In 1698, the Treaty of Partition proposed giving the throne to Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, a child descended from the Habsburgs, but his death in 1699 at the age of 7 left the plan in ruins and plunged Charles into deep sorrow. Charles's court was a hotbed of intrigues where factions multiplied. Supporters of Mariana of Neuburg, who favored Austria, clashed with those backing France. Clerics, with their immense influence, reminded the king that his decision would affect all of Christendom. The archbishops of Toledo and Seville, key figures in the court, participated in succession discussions, often with their own agendas. Foreign ambassadors, especially the French, filled the Alcazar with spies and promises, trying to tip the scales. Louis XIV, with his diplomatic cunning, sent gifts and letters, while Austria, militarily weaker, appealed to Habsburg family ties. England and the Netherlands maneuvered to prevent France or Austria from dominating the continent. As the years passed, Charles's health deteriorated. In the 1690s, his epileptic seizures became more frequent. His body was wasting away, and his mind, though lucid at times, was exhausted by the weight of an impossible reign. Desperate doctors resorted to increasingly absurd treatments. They applied herbal poultices, bled him until he was even weaker, and gave him useless potions. On one occasion, they administered a concoction made from animal entrails, believing it would revitalize his body. The court, in a state of constant paranoia, was divided between those who saw his death as imminent and those still hoping for a miracle. In the summer of 1700, Charles was on the brink of death. His body, ravaged by decades of illness, barely responded. Doctors, out of ideas, could only watch as the court prepared for the inevitable. Nobles and clerics gathered around the king, some with genuine tears, others calculating how to position themselves in the new order. It was then that Charles made the decision that would define his legacy, his will. On October 2, 1700, he dictated a document naming Philip of Anjou as his heir, on the condition that the Spanish Empire remain united and that Philip renounce any claim to the French throne. It was an attempt to protect Spain's autonomy, but also a recognition that the Austrian Habsburgs lacked the strength to maintain the empire. On November 1, 1700, Charles II died in the Alcazar of Madrid. He was 38 years old, but his body seemed that of an old man. His death was not a surprise. What was surprising was that he had survived so long. Chroniclers describe his end as a slow and painful process, with the king bedridden, unable to move, as the court surrounded him in tense silence. His last words, according to some, were, "Everything hurts." It was not the epitaph of a hero, but it was honest. He had spent his life grappling with a rebellious body and a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Charles's autopsy is a chapter that seems ripped from a Gothic novel. The doctors, with their morbid curiosity, opened his body and found a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, ulcerated intestines, and a brain that seemed to contain water. The most sensational detail was that he had only one testicle, black as coal. Was it true, or an attempt to justify the disaster of his reign? Probably a bit of both. Modern science points to genetic conditions like Klinefelter syndrome, which would explain his infertility and frailty, but in 1700, doctors could only marvel at the broken body of a king. The cultural context of Charles II's Spain is essential to understanding his reign. The Baroque, at its height, permeated every aspect of life. The literature of the Golden Age, though no longer shining as brightly as in the days of Cervantes or Lope de Vega, continued to produce works exploring mortality, vanity, and faith. Calderón de la Barca, who died in 1681, left a legacy of autos sacramentals that resonated in the court. His dramas, full of symbolism, reflected a society obsessed with death and redemption. Painting, meanwhile, was a vehicle for propaganda. Artists like Claudio Coelho used dark colors and grandiose compositions to portray Charles with a dignity his body could not sustain. Churches, with their golden altarpieces and dramatic sculptures, were a constant reminder of the divine presence in a world that seemed to be crumbling. Religion was the cornerstone of Spanish society. The Inquisition, though less ferocious than in previous centuries, remained vigilant, pursuing any sign of heresy. Belief in witchcraft, like the supposed spell on Charles, was not just a peasant superstition. At court, rumors of curses were taken seriously. Clerics wielded immense power, influencing not only spiritual matters but also political decisions. The archbishops of Toledo and Seville participated in succession discussions, often with their own agendas. Charles's devotion, spending hours praying in the Alcazar's chapel, was genuine but also a reflection of the pressure he felt to fulfill his duty as a Catholic king. The economy was Spain's Achilles' heel. The American silver, once the envy of Europe, had been squandered on wars and luxuries. Inflation had skyrocketed prices, and taxes, which fell mainly on peasants, were unsustainable. Cities like Madrid or Seville were filled with beggars, and rural areas suffered periodic famines. Reform attempts by figures like Medinaceli and Oropeza clashed with the resistance of a nobility living in a bubble of opulence. The bureaucracy, slow and corrupt, was incapable of adapting to the century's challenges. The American colonies, though still sending resources, were poorly managed, and corruption was endemic. On the international stage, Spain was a giant with feet of clay. France, under Louis XIV, was at its peak, and its armies did not hesitate to encroach on Spanish territories, especially in the Netherlands. England and the Netherlands, with their fleets and trade, were on the rise. Austria, the other Habsburg branch, was distracted by the Ottoman Turks. Defeats in the Netherlands and the Mediterranean were a reminder that the Spanish Empire could no longer impose its will. Charles, aware of this weakness, tried to maintain the dignity of his crown, but his health limited him. Charles's personal life was a drama in itself. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orleans was an attempt to strengthen ties with France, but also a source of sadness. Marie-Louise, young and full of life, contrasted with Charles's frailty. Her death, possibly from appendicitis, left the king devastated. Mariana of Neuburg, his second wife, was a polarizing figure. Her ambition and strong character made her a target of criticism, but also one of the few people who tried to guide Charles in his final years. The succession was the great drama of his reign. Once it became clear there would be no heirs, Europe became a diplomatic battlefield. French, Austrian, and English ambassadors filled the court with promises and threats. The partition treaties, like that of 1698, tried to avoid war, but the death of Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria left Charles with no easy options. His will, signed in a moment of physical weakness but mental clarity, was an attempt to preserve the empire's unity but also a spark that ignited a devastating conflict. When Charles died, the world changed. His death marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain and the beginning of a new era under the Bourbons. The War of the Spanish Succession, which broke out shortly after, was the unintended legacy of a king who only wanted to leave his kingdom intact. For ordinary Spaniards, his death was a moment of uncertainty but also resignation. The figure of Charles, fragile and tragic, became a symbol of a fading era. Charles II's reign is a lesson in the fragility of power. He was neither a hero nor a villain, but a man trapped in a broken body and an impossible historical moment. His life, marked by illness, intrigue, and a touch of absurdity, is a Baroque tragedy that reflects the decline of an empire. When he closed his eyes for the last time, the world he left behind was no longer his. But his story, with all its sadness and irony, continues to resonate as an echo of a time when even the frailest of kings could change the fate of nations. The Spain of Charles II was a mosaic of contradictions. Religious devotion permeated every aspect of life, from Holy Week processions to political decisions. The Inquisition, though less active, remained an ominous presence, watching for any sign of heresy. Belief in the supernatural, like Charles's supposed curse, reflected a society seeking answers in an uncertain world. Clerics, with their influence, guided not only souls but also policies, reminding the king that his duty was to protect the Catholic faith. Baroque art and literature mirrored this mindset. Calderon's works, with their themes of honor, destiny, and redemption, resonated in a court obsessed with appearances and morality. Painters like Coelho used light and shadow to create images that exalted royal power, even if reality was less glorious. Churches, filled with golden altarpieces and dramatic sculptures, were a constant reminder of the divine presence in a crumbling world. In the silence that followed his death, the Alcazar of Madrid seemed to hold its breath. The Habsburg dynasty, which had given Spain its days of glory, faded with a weak and sickly sigh. But in that silence, a new chapter was born, one in which Spain would have to find its place in a world that no longer belonged to it. Charles II, the Bewitched, was not a hero, but his story, with all its sadness and irony, remains one of the most fascinating in European history.